So I had no intentions of making a video today, but I saw this article on the Hollywood Reporter, and personally, I find it very, very funny. And that is Sony CEO Tony Vinciquerra. Vinciquerra, I'm sorry, I cannot roll my R's. Insists Madam Web isn't terrible and says the press just crucified it. Well, he's again the headline is correct about the fact that the press absolutely crucified Madam Web, but whether or not the movie wasn't terrible remains to be seen. And I do want to stress, I myself have not watched Madam Web, so this is not my personal opinion on the movie Madam Web, but a Spider-Man movie without Spider-Man in it was always going to be a recipe for disaster. I believe I made another video. I think it was right after Kraven the Hunter came out, where there was an article from Variety. I don't remember what it was called, but the meat and potatoes of the article, I believe the article was titled something along the lines of "Sony Spider-Man movies aren't dead yet." It was something along those lines. But the meat and potatoes of it was that the Venom movies with Tom Hardy gave Sony a false sense of security that they could make a Spider-Man movie without Spider-Man in it and it would still be successful. The problem is the only non-Spider-Man movie, the only Spider-Man movies absent Spider-Man... What's another way I can put it? The only Spider-Man spin-off movie that didn't contain Spider-Man to be successful were the Venom movies. Madam Web was an outright disaster. Morbius was an outright disaster. And I remember that movie got memed to absolute hell, Morbius, with it's Morbin time, and the memes spread around so wildly that Sony re-released Morbius back in theaters, and it bombed a second time. Yes, the memes did not save Morbius, and then obviously Madam Web, there were many like YouTube critics that just refused to touch the movie. Chris Stuckman like ruining his reputation. Chris Stuckman effectively ruining his reputation over just his refusal to touch Madam Web, and going so far as like, well, people worked really, really hard on that movie. Let's just ignore the fact that it's really, really bad, and we need to appreciate just how difficult it was to make that movie, blah, 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 blah. Completely ignoring the fact that it's, it doesn't matter how much blood, sweat, and tears went into making that movie. If the movie is bad, then call a spade a spade. But anyway, I am really, really tangenting. So let's get into the article. The film was received poorly by audiences and critics, referring to Madam Web, earning a record worst box office opening for a Sony superhero movie at the time of its release. Outgoing Sony Pictures CEO Tony Vinciquerra, I think it's pronounced Vinci. I think it's Vinciquerra, I think is how you pronounce his name, is defending Madam Web despite the harsh criticism the film received. An interview with the Los Angeles Times published Thursday, so this would be December 26th of 2024, Vinciquerra, who was stepping down as SPE boss at the end of the year, insisted that the superhero film released earlier this year, directed by S.J. Clarkson, starring Dakota Johnson and Sydney Sweeney, isn't bad, and blames the press for its negative reception. Quote, let's just touch on Madam Web for a moment. Madam Web underperformed in the theaters because the press just crucified it. It was not a bad film, and it did great on Netflix, he said. For some reason, the press decided that they didn't want us making these films out of Kraven the Hunter and Madam Web, and the critics just destroyed them. Why are you ignoring Morbius the Living Vampire? Okay, Morbius with Jared Leto also bombed spectacularly when that came out in 2021. But let's go through this first quote here. Right, Madam Web underperformed in the theaters because the press just crucified it. No, it wasn't just that the press crucified it. Is that you're doing a Spider-Man spin-off movie without Spider-Man, and unless if you were a diehard Spider-Man fan, you're not going to know who Madam Web is. Right, this was the same problem that plagued Morbius the Living Vampire. I know the movie was just called Morbius, but still, unless if you're a diehard Spider-Man fan, who's Morbius the Living Vampire? Who's Kraven the Hunter? That was the issue that Madam Web faced. It had nothing to do with the fact that the press crucified it. Madam Web could have been the bestest movie ever made. It was a Spider-Man spin-off movie without Spider-Man in it. And this state right here, it was not a bad film, and it's great on Netflix. Well, here's the reason Madam Web did great on Netflix. It's because Madam Web is so notorious as one of the worst movies of 2024, and when it got onto Netflix, people tuned into it just to see if it truly was as bad as everyone made it out to be. Just because something did great on streaming does not mean that the movie is good. Okay, there are people that actively seek out bad movies, and again, Madam Web has that distinction of one of the worst movies of 2024. And now you release it on the biggest streaming platform, at least in North America, which is Netflix. Yeah, people are going to tune in and watch it and just see, is it truly as bad as everyone made it out to be? That's it. That's the reason it did great on Netflix, in my opinion. It's not because it was a good movie. It's because everyone wanted to see just how bad Madam Web truly was, and they were not going to waste the money. They were not going to waste their money to go see it in the theaters. They were going to wait for it to come to streaming. But anyway, Vinciquerra continued to explain how the other Sony comic book movies had similar experiences. Quote, they also did it with Venom, but the audience loved Venom and made Venom a massive hit. These are not terrible films. They were just destroyed by the critics and the press for some reason, end quote. But again, the reason why Venom did so well, I argue, is two reasons. Number one is that Venom was a firmly established character in the comics. Okay, Venom went from a Spider-Man villain to an anti-hero in the comics. And number two is that Sony had been developing the Venom movie for at least a decade before the first Venom movie with Tom Hardy came out in 2018. Remember, Spider-Man 3 is the most notorious example of a movie with studio interference. Sony mandated that Sam Raimi put Venom in Spider-Man 3 because Sony back in 2007, 2008 wanted to do a Venom movie. So I would argue that that's why Venom succeeded, whereas Morbius and Kraven the Hunter and Madam Web bombed, is that the Venom standalone movie had been in development for over a decade. But I would also like to point out, I brought this up at the very beginning of this video, that there was that article from Variety, again titled something to the effect of Sony's Spider-Man movies aren't dead yet, where they made a great point about the fact that Venom gave Sony a false sense of security that, oh, we can make a Spider-Man movie without Spider-Man in it and audiences will flock to come see it. That might have worked in 2018, but 2024, audiences are now scratching their heads going, wait a minute, who's Kraven the Hunter? Okay, unless if you watched Spider-Man, the new animated series from the early 2000s, which, again, I would argue most fans probably don't even remember at this point, you're going to have no idea who Kraven the Hunter is. You have no idea who Morbius the Living Vampire is. You don't know who Madam Web is. Who are these characters? Again, comic book movies in the 2020s are not the same as in the 2010s. In the 2010s, you could get away with releasing a movie based on an unknown character and having it do really, really well, because comic book movies were all the craze. The comic book movie gimmick was all the craze in the 2010s. And look no further than the success of Guardians of the Galaxy. Nobody knew who the Guardians of the Galaxy were before the 2014 movie directed by James Gunn came out, and it did really, really well. You can't replicate it again in the 2020s because for most people, the comic book movie craze in general ended with Avengers Endgame, and now you have Sony that wants to keep going with all these Spider-Man spin-offs as if the end is not over, as if there's still, in 2014 to 2016 is absolutely ludicrous. But But here we go. Let's go ahead. Let's continue on with the article. We don't have much longer. The Hollywood Reporter's Madam Web review calls the film, quote unquote, an airless and stilted endeavor driven by a mechanical screenplay. Its lack of imagination would be astounding if it wasn't so expected. Madam Web doesn't concern itself much with the kind of specific background that might lend its characters some depth. The film operates on a need-to-know basis, forcing people to explain themselves through inelegantly breathless exposition, end quote. Madam Web opened to $26.2 million, which was a recorded worst for Sony superhero films at the time. Kraven the Hunter, released earlier this month, debuted to $11 million in the domestic box office, and I've already done a whole video as to, why Kraven the Hunter bombed, so I don't want to retread over old ground. When asked if the Spider-Man universe needs a new strategy, Vinciquerra replied, quote, I do think we need to rethink it just because it's snake-bitten. If we put another one out, it's going to get destroyed, no matter how good it is. End quote. That's not true. That is not true at all. What Sony needs to do with their Spider-Man spin-off movies is that they need to put Spider-Man in their Spider-Man movies. That was the problem with doing Kraven the Hunter, is that they wanted to recapture the success of Venom of, okay, let's take a Spider-Man villain, and instead of making him a villain, we're going to make him an anti-hero like Venom was. Venom and Kraven the Hunter are not the same character. How about this? How about make a Spider-Man movie with Kraven the Hunter as the primary villain? That would have done a lot better. But Sony still has their deal with Marvel Studios where Spider-Man can continue to appear in the MCU, but Sony cannot use Peter Parker Spider-Man. The only successful Sony Spider-Man spin-off movies were the Venom movies with Tom Hardy, because as I brought up, those movies had been in development for at least a decade before the first one with Tom Hardy came out in 2018. And the Spider-Verse movies, the ones featuring Miles Morales. So you have the Spider-Verse movies that do contain a Spider-Man, but it's not Peter Parker Spider-Man, it's Miles Morales Spider-Man, but still it is a Spider-Man. Sony is still producing a Spider-Man movie, granted it's animated. I would argue that that's why the Spider-Verse movies have done as well as they did. It's not just because the Spider-Verse movies were really good, what was the first one called? Is it Into the Spider-Verse? I think it's called Into the Spider-Verse. I could be wrong, but both of the Spider-Verse movies that Sony has put out have been really, really good on their own. But it also does contain Spider-Man. It's Miles Morales, as I brought up. And then you have Venom, which, like I said, has been in development for over a decade before the first movie even came out. So, was Madam Web unfairly crucified? Again, I'm not gonna say with 100% certainty, because I personally have not watched Madam Web. But the thing is, when you're gonna have box office results like how Madam Web had, it's a lot more than just, the press just unjustly crucified the movie at the time, blah 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 blah, and and they're pointing to the fact that, well, it did really good on Netflix, therefore it's a good movie, while they're completely ignoring the fact that Madam Web now has a notoriety of one of the worst movies of the year 2024. So people are going to deliberately seek it out to see if the movie truly was as bad as everyone made it out to be. And you have yet to see, blog posts or YouTube videos in the style of in defense of Madam Web. They just don't exist. So was Madam Web unjustly crucified? Maybe, maybe not. I think that the Sony CEO is basically just trying to save his ass on the way out the door, because doing Spider-Man spin-off movies without Spider-Man was just a really, really bad idea to begin with.